This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglan.
Having the best equipment can make a difference. Kentucky fishermen know this, but what they don't know is that today's modern fishing reels, in many ways, got their start in our capital city. We go inside outdoors with Kentucky Afield TV host Chad Miles for a trip to the Capital City Museum and a trip back in time for fishing reels as finely jeweled as your pocket watch. We reel in some Kentucky history next on Kentucky Afield Radio.
Boys were in trouble. About 10 seconds later, he said boys were going down.
A true story.
And it sunk right out from under us.
20 degrees.
Within seconds, one boating trip went
straight down.
The water was bone-chilling.
Once you hit that water, it's so cold you can't move.
The human body wasn't designed for this.
It took my breath away as soon as I hit it, and my hands were so cold in a matter of seconds that I couldn't pop the clip on my waders to get them off.
Conditions were so bad it's amazing that anybody survived.
Perfect for duck hunting, but not for a swim in the middle of a river.
Going overboard is never the thought.
You have to think ahead.
Fun can turn frantic in seconds.
There's no time to react when your world just sinks out from under you.
3 hunters, 2 survivors, 1 reason.
Your life jacket's got your back.
Make sure your first mate isn't your last.
I really don't think that I could have made it without a life jacket.
Your Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife reminds you, your life jacket's got your back, and the backing of sportsmen on winter water everywhere. We are on Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglan. A feature that maybe you have seen in the news already, or maybe you have seen the exhibit. Kentucky Afield magazine writer Lee McClellan had published a story. They came up on our winter program with the Kentucky Office of Adventure Tourism. We're talking about the unique and maybe even unlikely connection between Kentucky's capital city and the industry revolutionizing fishing reel. Kentucky Afield television host Chad Miles is with me for the hour. Bassmaster Miles, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You will never believe what I ran into just the other day. There was actually a kid in a candy store. You can imagine how happy this kid was.
I think I know who this kid was.
He had died and gone to heaven. He was on cloud 9. Let me get this. Kentucky Afield Radio.
Hog heaven.
Hog heaven. I forgot that one. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
He stumbled into a gold mine, this kid did. There's another call. Kentucky Afield Radio.
Happy as a pig in slop.
He's as happy as a pig in slop. That's perfect. There are more. Kentucky Afield Radio.
Charlie.
How happy was this kid?
As happy as a fox in a hen house.
What?
Happy as a kid on Christmas. Happy as a pup with 2 tails.
Suffice it to say, the kid was happy. 7th heaven. He was on top of the world, this kid was.
That pretty much sums up how I felt.
Was that you?
That was me.
I thought it was interesting how this TV shoot or this radio broadcast came about. Tell me that story. Hang on. Somebody from the hallway. What?
He was happy as a woodpecker in a lumberyard.
Woodpecker, lumberyard. That's great, but we've already moved a little bit forward in the bit. In comedy, timing is everything. Okay, Chad, where were we? Tell me the story.
You know, I have heard very briefly the story of the baitcasting reel with a multiplier being added, which is a gear, being really developed and finalized here in Frankfort, Kentucky. And put my hands on one a while back, about 4 or 5 years ago, very briefly looked at it. And that was kind of the end of the story. Interestingly enough, we were sitting here in the office, and you let me know that there's going to be a display at the Capital City Museum to kind of tell this story, the history of the Meeks and Milam reel. I knew I had to go down and see this display, and so we decided to take the TV crew with us, and you followed along and picked up some audio.
I thought it was interesting that Frankfort, Kentucky, of course known for laws and government, of course known for bourbon, But fishing reels sort of threw me a curve. I could see somebody found an old fishing reel maybe in their attic, and who hasn't seen one of these that their great-great-grandfather may have had, a bird's nest of line still in it someplace. But the more we looked into it, I know Nathan Brooks, he had looked into it and said, this has some real backbone to it. Mm-hmm. This is worth looking at. This isn't just somebody finding something in their garage. This is a whole collection of priceless gems. They called it the gems of the Bluegrass. Mm-hmm. Were these fishing reels of all things, and they were made by clockmakers and watchmakers. They were that precise.
And you can tell when you pick one up that they were made with that much precision. When you crank one right now and they feel like a brand new reel, you can tell how much precision they were built with. I mean, they were using equipment and machinery back then that was not automated to put out production parts like we have today. I mean, these were literally made
each one by hand.
Each one was like a brand new prototype. It was each one done for an individual, size for that person. It's an amazing story.
You have this scheduled on the Kentucky Afield TV show, January 21st and 22nd of 2017. But we're going to give you the full insight now on Kentucky Afield Radio. We'll play that interview that you had. Again, this is that kid in the candy store, Chad Miles, in Frankfort at the Capital City Museum.
So we're here today at the Capital City Museum, and I'm here with John Downs, who's curator, and we're here to talk about one of my absolute all-time favorite topics, and that is fishing reels. And you guys have some very unique reels that really started the history of baitcasting reels.
That's right. Frankfort has the unique distinction of being the place where the multiplying gear baitcasting reels were first produced in great quantities and perfected. The history of the baitcasting reel and its early mass production is really just about Frankfort.
Tell me a little bit about what a multiplying reel is.
Spin it once, it will bring in one spool of line. Mm-hmm. The multiplying reels and what the industry standard that the Meeks and the Milams came up with here was 4.3 to 1. Mm-hmm. So you spin it once and it brings in a lot more line. They were jewelers and watchmakers and silversmiths, and so they had the tools and the knowledge to make those fine gears. Some of them that are 150 years old still spin just as easy now as they did back then.
And not only was it the fact that it was a multiplying reel, it was actually designed and built for casting, which had really not been done prior to this.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And part of the thing is that the fishermen here didn't want to get out in the water. So with these things, you could cast farther without having to get into the deep water to get your feet wet in the creeks and rivers around here.
So the precision to allow a reel to free spool it and to cast it had to have been insanely precise.
Yeah. You had to use your thumb to break it. And they eventually came up with the drag and eventually came up with the click in their reels. And those were pretty much Meeks and the Milams and the other reel makers here in Frankfort all kind of collaborated. All the Frankfort reel makers apprenticed with the Milam brothers, who were the first folks here. And then it became Meek and Milam, and then they broke up and it became Milam, then became Meek again. George Gale was one of their apprentices. He made reels. And then another apprentice, James Sage, who was actually the superintendent of the gasworks in Frankfort, was also a reel maker.
I've had the pleasure of holding a couple of the old Meeks and Milam reels, and they had to have been fishermen, because it's interesting to me when you pick one up and it has a feel that fits really good in the hand. They're kind of small. And what I've noticed in baitcasting reels is that they kind of went away from that, and now they're back there again. Reel makers, they're making them really small where they fit in your hand, they're comfortable, and they're light. If you were a fisherman back then, you were going to hike down the Kentucky River and go fishing, you didn't want to be carrying something that weighed 5 or 6 pounds, right?
That's right, yeah. And they were all made to go on just cane poles. They didn't have fishing poles back in those days. You used just a cane. There's a story in there of a fellow who's still around. He's in his 90s, and he lives on the Elkhorn Creek, still fishes on the Elkhorn Creek. And he tells a story of every spring, and sometimes more than once through the summer, they'd go to town. Every hardware store had a barrel of cane poles that you just go and pick out the one you want and tie or screw your reel to it.
And that's really literally what they did. They just screwed it to the cane.
Interesting you say that they must have all been fishermen. One of the Milam brothers actually was not a fisherman. He was into the technical. He probably did more for what eventually became known as the Kentucky reel than all the other guys put together, because he was really a technical innovator. The drag, the click, and the 4.3 to 1 ratio that they ended up settling upon that became the Frankfort reel standard.
So the Kentucky reel really is a class of reels that came out of Frankfort.
That's right.
And they had their own look and feel and design. And then after that, there came other types of reels.
Yes, and there were other reel makers in Kentucky, but the Milams and then Meek and Milam firm, they were the first that made them in quantities, and it happened right here, just around the corner on Main Street.
This is Charlie Baglan. Today, it's Kentucky Afield Television on Kentucky Afield Radio. It's Charlie Baglan. We're back in our second segment of Kentucky Afield Radio with something a little different today. Chad Miles, who is our host on Kentucky Afield Television, is our guest for the hour, giving you sort of the long version of something you will see on TV. It's all about Kentucky's pivotal connection with the design and production of the baitcast fishing reel. A display that's called the Jewels of the Bluegrass, precision handcrafted fishing reels made by Frankfort, Kentucky jewelers. We're talking over 100 years ago. These names, maybe you've heard of them, Meeks, Milam, Gale, Sage. They were setting standards with features found still today on our very best fishing reels. A collection that is in pristine condition and on exhibit in the city where they were first made, Frankfort. It's at the Capital City Museum. It's open free of charge to the public, 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock local time, closed on Sundays. Well worth your drive from wherever you're hearing the show. You got to remember, this was pre the industrial age. One key thing that made the Industrial Revolution the revolution was something called interchangeable parts. That one part could be taken from another and fit another piece, such as screws. But these reels were each made by hand. You couldn't take them apart and apply one to the next. They were individually customized.
And it's one of the ways that they aged these reels. Each individual screw would be turned. The screw and the side plate of this reel would be numbered so that when you took it apart to do your yearly maintenance, you had to put it back exactly the way it came apart.
There was no tap and die.
No, there was no tap and die. It was literally cut in there, and then the thread would be chased and tried, and then recut again and tried until it fit perfectly.
It is amazing. Now, you actually held one in your hand.
Absolutely. You can feel the precision in these reels. And I'll tell you, for a person to try to visualize this, it reminded me a whole lot of holding a Garcia Ambassador Series reel, which was probably the most popular, most common reels of the 80s and 90s. And you look at it and you go, wow, I see where they got their design.
This is a fascinating story. Chad, let's go back to the TV interview you did with curator John Downs.
And they really weren't mass-produced in the beginning, right?
No, they made, 5, 6, 7 a month. They were all, for the most part, custom-made. They didn't just make a bunch of them and advertise them to sell them. You had to tell them what you wanted. And their catalog was broken up in brass or in silver, German silver, nickel, really, and whatever kind of parts you wanted on it. And
some of it even have some intricate details on the side of the reel. They've engraved them to personalize them a little bit.
Yes, yep. We have several engraved in our exhibit. One of them belonged to Judge Hazelrig, who is attached to one of the most notorious events in Frankfort history. He is the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals of Kentucky, who administered the oath of office to William Goebel after he was shot.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So we have Judge Hazelrig's reel in our exhibit. So, yeah.
I'm excited to see them, and so we can actually see some of the reels. We actually here today have some of the tooling that was made to produce these reels as well.
Right, yeah. The lathe that the Meeks bought in 1830s maybe, probably from Switzerland. And it's likely that every one of these reels in our exhibit and every one of the Meek and or Milam reels in the country have parts that were made on this machine. But this machine was also, it was the Meeks, and then then it became Meek and Milams. Then when they broke up, it became Milams. And then when Milam's son died, it was sold to George W. Gale, and he used it to make Gale reels. Gale's son, Clarence, was making very inexpensive fly fishing reels out of aluminum. And then the market fell out for his stuff. Come to find out, some Japanese manufacturers were making copies of his reels. They even said George W. Gale and Son, Frankfort, Kentucky, but they came in boxes covered in Japanese, and at half the price what he could make them for.
Wow.
Well, he was given a government contract to make parts for Clinton Engineer Works, which, as it turns out, was the front for the Manhattan Project. And so he was making 20 different parts with this lathe for the Manhattan Project, which is where they enriched the uranium for the atomic bombs that were later dropped on Japan. So he was making 20 parts. Only one of them was the real part they wanted, but to kind of keep it secret in case anybody find out, what little Clarence Gale was doing in little old Frankfort, Kentucky. But he made parts for the Manhattan.
So full circle, Japan's sending over reels that literally almost put a man out of business.
That's right.
That had to take a second job, that did not know it, unbeknownst to him, was working on a project that ended up being used to bomb Japan.
Yeah, and he had no idea what he was doing it for.
Yeah,
It was just some company in Tennessee, as far as he knew.
That's karma. I'm excited to get in here and see the reels and to walk through some of the history of it. I don't collect old reels, but I collect some old lures. And I know there are a lot of people out there that have been handed down equipment that they may think, this is how they did it years ago, and a grandfather or so may have given them a reel. They may have stored it in the attic. People hear what some of these things can be worth. They may be digging through their attic trying to find out what Grandpa actually had.
We have a reel that actually belongs to the museum that was given to us by a man when he was in the Army Air Corps in World War II. One of his buddies was another guy from Kentucky, and they ended up with this old bunch of tackle and gear, and there was one of these brass JF and BF Meeks in it. And they, it's like, that's old, we're into Shakespeare and Pfluger and the new stuff, But they kept it. Eventually they realized, and they stayed in touch through their whole lives, even though they separated. One went to Transy, one went to UK when they got back from the war. And they saw an article in the Courier Journal, I guess, back in the 70s or 80s, and realized, there could be something to this old beat-up brass reel. And so they swore that they were going to give it to a museum one day. Well, Leon, his one buddy, he passed away about 15 years ago. And at 85, Fred was the other guy's name, who had it. He contacted us and said, I'm getting on, and we swore it need to go to a museum. Literally, he put it in a box and kept it in his basement for 40 years before we realized what he had.
What are some of these very early reels worth?
500, 600, 800 are probably really cheap ones.
Yeah.
We have a couple in there that are worth several thousand.
If you start thinking about something this size, this many parts, moving parts and pieces, handmade for one individual by a jeweler, you couldn't buy one today for that.
No. The interesting thing is we have an 1860 catalog in there, and the cheapest reel that Meek and Milam firm made was $13. Well, if you were in the U.S. Army during the Civil War in the 1860s, 61, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were only making $13.50. Soldiers were making $13.50. So that was, and even that was good pay for an average American. So $13 was big money.
What was the top at that point?
I don't remember. I think it was $26 maybe for a German silver one.
A sixth of a year's salary.
Yeah.
For the average American to get one of these high-end reels.
Yeah. But about the same time when America was industrializing for everything, the late 19th century, early 20th century, Clarence Gale in the 20s started mass producing his fly reels just out of stamped aluminum, where you could sell them for 35, 50 cents, 75 cents, as opposed to, $25 or $35 for the handmade ones.
What I'm gathering from this group of craftsmen is that their skill and expertise lied in the gear manufacturing. And if you take a fly rod and a fly reel, really you got the knob out on the end. It's one crank equals one rotation for the most part. These guys are really trying to figure out ways to really cast something out there and get a lure back in at a fast pace. So if a fly reel is, you got a knob on there, it's 1, 1, 1, and they were doing 4.3 per rotation. Now the spinning reel, it was introduced, I think, in another country back in the 1900s. But on that, your spool doesn't spin. Your line spins around the spool.
Yes.
So it is an easier reel for a novice to learn to use because you don't have to use your thumb as a brake. The spool's not spinning.
They didn't cast these like we are used to casting. They cast them underhanded, instead of overhead. That's just the way they fish. That's how they decided this was the best way to do it.
And you still see a lot of people with the bait casters still use different underhand casting methods. And it depends on where you're at. I mean, back then, casting overhand's nice and easy, or you're standing in the middle of the water fly fishing. That's what people get out there to fly fish. It really is to get that line and rod moving. Yeah, you put you closer to the fish, but you can't stand on the bank with overhanging branches and cast like this.
Yes.
If you're out in a boat, you could start casting, overhand, and you don't worry about catching something.
Yeah, and these were before really people were fishing from boats.
Yeah.
This was definitely from the bank. But this was going to be trouble wherever
Problematic,
you went.
If I went today and went onto a bank it was all overgrown and I was going to try to cast one of these reels, we'd probably be casting it underhanded.
Sure.
Because you're going to try to really quick roll cast something out there so that you can get the bait out there without being hung in the tree.
That's right.
So that makes a lot of sense that they designed them to be cast that way, because that's the waters that they had.
Didn't just grow up here. George Snyder in Paris, who about 20 or 30 years before the Milam brothers, took a British reel that was a 1-to-1 and took it apart and remade it with some, not 4.3, but a little more multiplying gear. So there are a few Snyder's reels around that are older than the Meeks and Milams, and they're mostly from Paris, Kentucky.
Okay.
Apparently one of them, either the Milam brothers were familiar with the Snyder reels, or someone brought one in, or someone had one to showed it to them. Can you remake me another one of these, or fix this one? And that's really where it started. So it didn't just, hey, let's do this. It was kind of a gradual thing that they took the idea from other people.
We're back in the studio. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Television. On the show today, Chad Miles, our host there, is exploring the jewels of the Bluegrass in the form of historic fishing reels, jeweler quality. They are all on display through 2017 at the Capital City Museum in Frankfort. We have a fishing report just ahead. Then we will meet Betty Barr, president of the Old Reel Collectors Association. So more history still ahead on Kentucky Afield Radio. Baglan back on Kentucky Afield Radio into our second half hour. If you would like to hear this show again, or if you would like to see what Kentucky Afield TV has produced, you can find them both on YouTube. We're also a podcast, so you can find the show on iTunes and like us on Facebook. You can catch our weekly link there as well. So think about it. What's your favorite reel? I personally date back to the Zebco 202. It's a 2.5 to 1 gear ratio. On the show today, we're talking about reels, again, back to the Civil War era, that were setting standards at 4.3 to 1. That's the speed of retrieve. More with historic fishing reels. First, our fishing report.
Hi, this is Kevin Fry with your Eastern Area Fisheries Report. Crappie anglers are faring well at lakes and shallow water along shoreline areas. Larger white crappie to 13 inches in catches at Dewey Lake and to 12 inches at Buckhorn Lake. Most streams this winter have stayed fairly clear, offering good smallmouth bass fishing. Most anglers using plastic worms, lizards, and tubes fish slow on or near the bottom. At Fish Trap Lake, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are currently allowing the lake to draw down significantly below winter pool. This is for repair work. This will eliminate use of the boat ramp at the dam from approximately January 16th to the end of the month. Boat access at this ramp should return approximately in February as the lake is allowed to fill then.
This is Justin with your fishing report from the Northeast. First off are sauger in the Ohio River. Fish usually are staged up behind locks and dams in the mouths of feeder creeks. For our district, you'll be looking at Greenup Lock and Dam and Melville Dam. For Greenup, you can fish from the bank on the Ohio side near the dam. For the best bet, you need a boat. Up at Meldal, there's a new fishing pier below the electric portion of the dam that juts out into the river and will get you close to the tailwaters of the dam. Anglers have been having some luck off the fishing pier and close to the hydro with curly-tailed grubs fished on jig heads. Some anglers have been fishing down off the beach area and having luck there as well. That should do it for us in the Northeast. Remember, this time of year, conditions can change quickly. Beware of ice on boat ramps and docks. Always stay safe out there.
Hey, this is Eric Cummins with your Southwest Kentucky Fishing Report. Crappies have been good at Barren and Green River Lakes on brush piles or laydowns. Depth there will depend on your water color and clarity. Also, Barren and Green River Lake tailwaters have been good in the slack water areas for crappie. Muskie have been fair at Green River Lake with shad and alewife colored swim baits, crankbaits, or jerk baits. Again, those sun-drenched banks are best. Also in the tailwater of Green River Lake, muskie have been good, again, in those slack water areas, fishing the same assortment of baits. Walleye and sauger fishing is excellent below Green River Lake Dam, using swim baits or drifting, soft plastics or baits to through those current breaks and off current areas. As always, good luck and good fishing. Be sure your life jacket's got your back.
Hunting elk in Kentucky is a dream come true for many, and I want to add my name to that list.
And I want to add mine.
If you want to add yours,
the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife website is Elk Central. The Pick 4 option lets you put your name in the hat for cow, bull, archery, or firearm.
Plus youth tags.
The deadline is midnight, April 30th.
This could be my year.
And it could be yours.
Register for incredible Kentucky elk hunting at fw.ky.gov.
Kentucky's Nature and Wildlife Fund. You see it as a contribution option when you prepare your state tax return. But you also see it as songbirds and wildflowers. You can see it in clear flowing streams. Sometimes it's so secluded you may never see it at all. But if you only see it on your PC as you prepare your taxes, that's good too. Google it and see the difference this fund makes. Kentucky's Nature and Wildlife Fund, the natural tax shelter.
We are back in our second half hour on Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglan. If you're just joining us, what we're doing in this show is looking at an aspect of Frankfort, Kentucky that is totally unknown to folks who have lived there and worked there their entire lives. It goes beyond the Bourbon Trail. It goes beyond state government. Chad Miles from Kentucky Afield Television and I are talking about Frankfort's connection to the fishing reel industry. You can find the video on YouTube or catch it on Kentucky Afield TV. This dates back to like the Civil War era. What was your interest in this? And I remember you had said something the other day about you worked on a lathe, that your father was a machinist.
Mm-hmm. My dad, people who don't know me, I was raised in a family who he was a machinist and a perfectionist. He loves precision parts. He loves working on things. He's built a motorcycle. Every single thing we broke around the house, he took it to heart to try to fix it. He's also an avid fisherman. He has a love for quality, and I guess he's kind of passed that on to his kids. So when I get in there and I see that someone took their passion and took their hands and tools and said, you know what, I'm going to change the fishing industry and the fishing world forever because of that passion for quality, it really resonated with me. And when I saw it, I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. I could see my dad trying to build one of these reels. He knows about the exhibit. He's going to go check it out. It would shock me if he doesn't come back and consider building one of these reels.
There's your Christmas present for next year already.
Oh, I hope.
That would be neat. What year were these created? Do you remember the era?
You know, it seems like they started. It was late 1700s, if I'm not mistaken.
Really?
Yeah, it was.
That goes back.
So you think about every one of these being hand-delivered on a horseback. People that were going to go fishing, I mean, for 100 years were doing it not in a car. They were walking with this reel, or they were going on horseback to go fishing. And these were the reels they were using. And if you look at them today, minus a couple of new advancements, they're pretty functional, just like a reel would be used today. I'll tell you an interesting thing. I've been offered the opportunity to take one out and go fishing with it.
I was hoping that would happen. I was really hoping, but I dare not, because these are on display, priceless artifacts.
Oh, yeah.
Who asked you to go?
I have an individual that works here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife that happens to have one, and they've said that, you know what, if you'd like to take one of these out and take it fishing, you're welcome to do so. There's only one way to do that, and that would be with the original cotton line that came on it. And, you know, who knows? I'd probably have to get dressed up in a bow tie and fish like they did back then.
You did.
With
people got dressed
and
up back then. You see old drawings and sketches. They were out there in suits, these men were.
Oh, yeah. They'd hike their pants leg up or wear knickers, and that's how they went. And they went in their Sunday best a lot of times. You see how these people went about their leisure activities, and it was with really, really precise pieces of equipment, these reels, and in their Sunday's best clothes.
It reminds you of croquet or maybe lawn tennis, where people would actually dress up to do these things.
Or if you've seen pictures of golfers from in the turn of the century and how they wore, that's kind of how the fishermen dressed. A lot of little hats and bow ties and wool clothes.
So if you go out with an old reel, you're pretty much obligated to catch an old fish. And the older the fish is, the bigger it is.
Let's hope it turns out that way.
So if you use old line, you have to use an old pole. let's talk about the other old things that were down there. I remember the split cane rod that was on display down there. I'd never seen one like that. Reminded me sort of I didn't want to say it, but a pool cue.
These bamboo or cane type rods that they used to fly fish back then, to make them stronger, what they would do is they would literally, some of them would be 5 and 6 pieces. So they would take what would be not much bigger than a toothpick at the end, and it would taper all the way down 6, 8, 9 feet to the handle where they put a cork on it, and they would cut that to where you'd imagine if you were looking at the end of it, it'd be kind of like looking at a pie. They would cut that into individual pieces, 7, 8, 10 feet long, however long the rod was, and then they would use an epoxy and glue them together. Each individual piece would be cut to fit that using a planer. And once they'd plane those pieces and get it out exactly as they wanted, that would the final part would be like plywood. It would be much stronger because you would have an epoxy and a 6-piece rod that would be put together, and it would be a much stronger, and it wouldn't tend to bend or warp like you would get out of a piece that you cut that long in one single piece. It would warp over time. And an intense amount of craftsmanship that would go into these rods. And you can still buy them like this today, but you better have some deep pockets.
Chad, we're to a point now where you have a special guest on the TV interview who knows more about old fishing reels than I bet anybody alive. Let's go back to Frankfort, the Capital City Museum.
Now we have Betty Barr here with us, and she is president of the Old Reel Collectors Association. You're located right here in Frankfort.
Yes, I live in Frankfort.
So you're going to walk me through some of these reels, several different manufacturers, different sizes, and show me some of the different options that you could have elected to have back then.
Well, there are 4 reel makers represented. The Meeks, who were the first, then Milam, Gale, and Sage.
And you've got these laid out here really based on size. They go from very, very small, which is the 1, and they go on up to, they even get bigger than what you've got on display here, right?
The biggest we have here on display are the 6.
And that reel is, a lot of people who bass fish today, or musky fish, striper fishermen use bigger reels than that. But so this is a representation of really from very, very small up to a large reel that.
Well, they actually made up to a 12, but the bigger reels were made for tarpon, obviously for saltwater fishing, which people didn't do around here.
Talk to me a little bit about the materials that were used.
Originally, when they made the first reels, now we're talking the 1830s, they were brass. About 1840, they developed the ability to electroplate. So they made German silver, which actually is not silver. It's tin, copper, and zinc. Look at these. You've got to know they're 150 years old or older, and they are remarkably resilient. These reels, they were precision made. They were made by clockmakers, silversmiths, and these men made the reels like they would a clock. So they had brass and steel gears, and they were multiplying reels. That's what made them so famous.
If an individual was digging through, someone in their family's heirlooms and ran across a reel, tell me quickly how they would try to age that reel.
The earliest reels would have had numbered screws because at that point they had to hand make all of the screws.
So there wasn't a way to buy production-made screws. You had to hand turn the screw and fit it to where you cut the hole.
Yes, exactly. So if you look at some of these older reels, and here's a Meek and Milam number 2, it has 2 numbered screws. That was about 1870. This one has 3 numbered screws, 1, 2, 3. It's on the plate of the screw as well as the head plate. That would have been about 1850s.
And the reason they did that is these reels were designed to be taken apart and maintained.
They recommended every year you take the head plate off, use porpoise oil, and they actually sold it. And you use that to lubricate the reel and to clean it.
And then you'd put it back together, making sure that you align the correct screw with the right hole.
Exactly.
And now this one here has a unique characteristic, which we still see today, and that is
the counterbalance.
The counterbalance. What do we got here?
Ivory.
Ivory.
Readily available in the 1800s.
And this one here you said is...
a buffalo horn.
Buffalo horn.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sage exclusively used buffalo horn. He was one of the makers in Frankfort. He was in Frankfort only about 10 years making reels. Mm-hmm. He was actually a gunsmith from Connecticut.
Really?
So he was the only one that wasn't a clockmaker or a silversmith originally. He liked the buffalo horn. This is the number 2. That's a very unusual one. That's the number 3. They were the most common. He made about 100 reels in Frankfort. And then he moved to Lexington, but continued to use the same stamp.
Oh, wow.
So you can find a Sage that says Frankfort, Kentucky, but if the serial number is more than 100, it was made in Lexington.
Made in Lexington.
Uh-huh.
So tell me some other characteristics on here, because I noticed that these look like they're screws that have screwed something on, but these are actually movable. These engage something.
They made clicks and drags, and the clicks they put on... Originally, they put them on trout reels. They were trying to prevent backlash. These reels would have been hard to cast. You had to get used to it so that you wouldn't get a bird's nest.
So you could actually engage the clicker or the drag by simply sliding the screw to the left or to the right. What type of drag systems did they have?
Bigger ones, the drag was tighter because obviously you're going to have a bigger fish on.
Okay.
And the smaller ones, the drag was not quite. They still had a lot of play to them. They spun easily with the drag on.
And very different from most of the reels that we have today. We have what's called a level wind that would ride back and forth here on one of these frame mounts and would put the line back on the reel in a level fashion. I'm assuming that using one of these required one of these motions
You had
where
to
you
feed the line on with your fingers to keep it from piling up on one side. So you'd feed it as you brought it in.
And I'm sure that that became something that you just did automatically. Yeah. Even reeling a fish in, you'd want to make sure that all the line wasn't stuck on one side. So,
the other thing that's interesting is they usually put the reel on the bottom. See, these are all right hand.
Oh.
They didn't do right hand, left hand. They were all right hand reels.
So these reels did not sit on top of the rod like we're used to throwing a baitcaster today.
If you look, now this is BC Milam fishing. If you look, he's got his on the bottom. But I suppose you could do it either way.
Back in the studio, Betty Barr, president of the Old Reel Collectors Association, is our special guest along with Chad Miles from Kentucky Afield Television. Back to wrap up our visit with Frankfort's fishing reels, which set modern-day standards back 150 years ago. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We're back on Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglan. In our last segment, featuring my friend Chad Miles from Kentucky Afield TV, sort of a long version of a feature you can find on the TV show about the surprising connection that Kentucky, and more specifically Frankfort, Kentucky, holds with the early days of manufacturing the bait-casting fishing reel. It's a one-of-a-kind display of handcrafted fishing reels. Jeweler precision. You can see it for yourself at the Capital City Museum in downtown Frankfort. And Chad, you want to go back, I can tell. And if you have friends that come into town, I bet you're going to take them there to see this, won't you?
Oh, absolutely. And I can't wait to get my dad down there.
Okay, let's say somebody listening has some of these old reels somewhere in their attic or their basement. What are they looking for? How will they know?
Well, I mean, if you pick one up and it still works today, and it's 100 years old, it's probably a very well-made reel. You're probably not talking about one of the Japanese knockoffs at that point in time. There were several names that were made here in Frankfort, Kentucky. First off, they'll probably be stamped with Frankfort, Kentucky. If that's the case, there were some reels that were also made in Pennsylvania and upstate New York. But really, you had two hotbeds in the United States for reel production. And it was upstate New York. And those reels were really designed for the type of fish they fish for up there, a lot of trout. And my understanding is that as the settlers packed their goods and started moving west, they came to Kentucky, and the type of fish that we had, a lot of muskie, which was known as the muskellunge, the reels that they were using weren't suited for it. So they decided at that point in time to redesign these reels with these gears. So if you have a reel that's old and it says Frankfort, Kentucky, and if you turn the handle on it one time and the spool turns more than one time, it's a very good chance you may have a small little piece of history there.
Chad, let's pick up with your chat with Betty Barr.
So what else have you got here?
Well, you'll notice as the reels get older, this is probably this is the oldest one that we could get for the exhibit. It's about 1940, and it was made by J.F. and B.F. Meek. That was the first stamp. That's when the two brothers were working together. And it's relatively plain. As you get older and the reels go on, you'll notice they become more decorative, and you've got a lot of knurling on the side of the faceplate. Ivory handles get a little fancier.
What's interesting about this one, this is the first one that I've seen that actually has the double paddle. You see some up here that have the counterweights. This is the first one I've seen that has a double paddle on there.
Well, all of these reels were special ordered. Someone wanted that. And it was engraved. See, it was a WFH on the back. It could have been for a gift. We call those presentation reels. These are two examples of presentation reels. This one has a double handle. Yeah, they probably sat on somebody's desk.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't ever even used.
Exactly.
Another thing that I find that's different in a lot of these reels is that on this particular reel, if the reel is sitting there, where you crank and drive the reel is actually set at what we call 12 o'clock, straight up and down. Now, some of these, they're actually in a different location.
They're 6 o'clock.
They're 6 o'clock?
You could order them that way.
You can order it based on...
If you look over on the wall, we have an example from a catalog. At one point, there were 660 different choices that you could make.
Really?
Size, material, type of grasp, where you wanted the handle. They were all permeations of choices.
What else have we got here?
Well, we've got some Gales. We haven't talked about Clarence Gale. Now, they say George W. Gale and Son. George never made a reel. I'm pretty sure that that's the case. He was an apprentice at the Meek and Milam shop. But these guys were clockmakers and silversmiths. And so he never made a reel, but his son, Clarence, was the real machinist. And Clarence is an interesting person. He was considered in the United States one of the best machinists. He had a third-grade education.
Really?
He was a highly skilled maker of many things, but he started out with fishing reels, and he developed the raised gearbox, and they call it the top hat design. And he made some beautiful reels. So he made this presentation reel. We consider these the jewels of the collection, and he made the one that is so decorative.
I'm interested in this for a lot of reasons. Obviously, I love fishing. I love bait casting reels, but my dad's a machinist. And he loves tinkering around with stuff like this. So
that's how you knew so much about the lathe.
Well, I knew a lot about the lathe. I've ran a lathe quite a few times, but my dad's a machinist and a perfectionist. So he would, I'm sure he'll be down here to see this exhibit. Here's one here that has a level winder.
Ben Meek was the one who developed the level wind in the United States. He actually did it for Horton Manufacturing Company. He was a real inventor. He was the brains. He'd never fished. He was a bookworm.
Really? So some people came to him with problems. When I'm out there fishing, I really wish my reel would do this. And he came up with solutions, came up with reasons.
He came up with a spur gearing and the jeweled bearings. So the pivot went into a jeweled bearing to make it
back then, were they filing patents on these ideas?
No. Ben Meek said, if anybody can make a reel as well as I can, go for it.
So there was never...
Yes. And these reels, when he made them, they were $50.
Yeah.
That was a lot of money.
Whoa, yeah.
And so they were owned by people of means.
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate your time and we're taking us through here. And, the next time I grab my reel and go to make a cast, I'm going to kind of think back of the history that it took to get to where we're at today.
And what you wore.
Oh, yeah.
You guys wore suits.
You didn't wear sweatpants and shorts and stuff, did you? You dressed up.
Yes.
You see
it was a gentleman's sport.
It really was. I don't know if I want to go back that far, but I like the. I love the reels, and I'd love to put one of these to use at some point in time. But I'll probably do it in my normal fishing attire.
Yeah, me too.
Well, thank you so much for taking me through this. I really do appreciate it.
Back in the studio with fishing fiend Chad Miles from Kentucky Afield TV. We've talked about this for an hour, but words still won't do it justice. You really need to see it for yourself.
Any fishermen, artisans, craftsmen, if they're in the Frankfort area, to swing by and check it out. I think they will be amazed when they start seeing the age of these reels and to see how they look like something that could be used today.
The fishing reel exhibit is called The Jewels of the Bluegrass, on display through the year, throughout 2017. So admission is free. The Capital City Museum is open from 10 o'clock in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, Monday through Saturday. Check out more at capitalcitymuseum.com. We're out of time. This is Charlie Baglan inviting you. Join us in a week and we'll go inside, outdoors again, here on Kentucky Afield Radio.